As policies change from state to state and at the federal level with regard to women's rights, Title IX, women's private spaces like locker rooms and restrooms, and the protection of women's sports with regard to making sure that just biological women are competing against other biological women, it can feel like there's no chance to actually push back against where we're headed. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Let's continue here with Sarah Parshall Perry, Senior Legal Fellow at Heritage Foundation. Let's start with the low hanging fruit, if we could. It sure seems like after seeing in the state of California just yesterday, where a track and field state championship included a transgender young woman placing second place, that would then displace a biological young lady from getting the medal stand and potentially getting a scholarship to a state school through their through their athletic abilities. This seems like a real easy discrimination case, right?
Yes, and in fact, I think this is perfectly germane to what we've just seen happen at the Department of Education. We've just seen a closing comment period on the new Title IX athletics rule from the Department of Ed that indicates you cannot categorically prohibit transgender athletes from competing in the sport according to their gender identity. Now, in the higher levels in high school and college, they've allowed for what looks a lot like flexibility, where you can account for things like injury and competitive nature of the particular sport. But what that's simply done is force these schools and universities to get into a calculus, a balance of the equities, where if they decide incorrectly and they, for example, rule against transgender participation in a sport, they're going to be faced with a civil rights complaint and possible loss of their federal funding. So if you are the chancellor of the University of California, San Diego, and you decide that you're going to rule in favor of biological women over a biological man, you could very well lose your state funding. That's not a calculus that the law requires under Title IX. We saw 154,000 comments come in. So clearly, this rule hasn't pleased anyone from the right or the left, those who sort of support scientific notions of sex and those who don't. So at this point, I think it's when this administration will see competing civil rights claims, when it is a biological male fighting essentially a Title IX complaint and a biological female filing a counter complaint. This department's going to have to reckon with exactly how ridiculous their interpretation of this federal civil rights law is.
Yeah, just again, and I'm just fascinated in the legal aspects of this and the legal theories behind supporting these laws. In other words, you know, if me, a heterosexual male, identifying as male, if I go into a private space that is designated for women, like a locker room, like a public restroom, I have violated a law of some sort just by being there. I don't have to touch anyone. I don't have to harass anyone. I don't even have to look at anyone. Just by being there, I've violated a law because of objective realities that we have defined as a society, right? What about these laws now that they're sort of changing or that they're reinterpreting? Do they have to wait for a sexual assault? Or, for instance, when a biological male athlete is in a woman's private space, can that athlete or the institution be sued for allowing it before something horrible happens?
They can. And let me tell you, I think that's a lot of what we're going to see at this point with this interpretation of sex to include gender identity. And this administration has used that interpretation through the Department of Justice, through the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education. You name your federal governmental agency, and this administration has decided sex is the same as gender identity. That means that where there is a public space that is implicated by federal funds, if it is subject to federal contracts, federal law, you're going to have a very hard time proving your particular safety or security or privacy was violated in favor of someone who is the opposite biological sex. Not until we see widespread attempts to roll back these laws, either by a new presidential administration or by a series of federal lawsuits, some of which have already been launched because of the illegal interpretation of these longstanding federal civil rights laws. We will not see this administration education, take a step back. The goal, in my estimation, is to make as much of a change as possible in these longstanding laws and to concretize what has always been considered to be male versus female into something that is however you want to feel at the particular time. So if
Well,
there is a federal implication, unfortunately, it's going to be very hard.
that's that last part that you, however you particularly feel at any given time, because again, I've signed a lot of contracts in my lifetime, and usually the first third of a contract is just definitions, so that
Yeah.
everybody agrees on what the words in the contract mean, right? If gender identity is now something, it needs to be defined, doesn't it? You need to be able to prove a gender identity. How do you prove something that is ultimately a thought or an expression versus a scientific or biological reality? I mean, there's no denying the fact that I am a man, but if I identify as a woman, how would I prove that? In other words, I mean, a woman could dress the same way I dress, right? I mean, there is no specific must a man wear a dress to then say I identify as a woman? What if it's a woman who happens to like wearing jeans? I mean, I don't mean to talk in circles on this, but that's what makes it so hard to actually have an argument in this case or even discuss these things. So then, how do you extrapolate it into the law?
Well, you can't, and that's part of the problem. There is no self-limiting principle to something relative to an individual's subjective self-identity. And the
Right.
entire canon of American civil rights law has never utilized self-identity as a protected characteristic. Why? Because just as you said, Larry, it's impossible to prove. That's why the Supreme Court's equal protection jurisprudence has relied traditionally on those immutable characteristics: race, national origin, sex, ethnicity. Those are characteristics that you can prove. Those are individuals who are typically marginalized because of those characteristics. Those are the individuals we want to protect. Unfortunately, these individuals want the same protection. You
Right.
can believe whatever you want. Tell me you're a cabbage. That's great. I'm not going to make a salad with you. So thanks very much. That's your own self subjective identity. I cannot legally be asked to ascribe to that same identity or to change the course of my life, make decisions based on your identity.
I gotta add, this is really important and high-minded stuff, and hopefully, it's resonating with people, Sarah, because in our final minutes here, I guess the larger question here is how did we get here? Because there used to be certain things that whether you were progressive or a liberal or a socialist or conservative, there's still some fundamental things that before we actually engage in a conversation or even an argument, we believe and agree on those fundamental things. On this debate, that's out the window too.
Yes, it is. And it's hard to say exactly where things went wrong. Again, I would look back at Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015 and remember that conservatives were called alarmists because many of us indicated this was sort of the beginning of the slippery slope argument. We
Yeah.
went from Obergefell in 2015 to Bostock in 2020 to now an entire governmental push at the federal level and now in many states to include gender identity and even in Minnesota, youth attracted persons as protected sexual characteristics under
Yeah.
civil rights law. The minute we open up the door to fight back against natural law, moral order, what has been consistently held by Western democracies to be the appropriate order of things, we know that immediately we're going downhill and we're going downhill fast.
It's an incredibly important column. The trans mind virus is mutating at the American Conservative, and it's not overstating the case because it's one of those fundamentals. And I'd love for you to have the last word here, Sarah Parshall Perry, to sort of give us a little hope about where these conversations are going, because it bothers me that one political party seems to be so on board so
Yes.
radically on this issue.
I think I can begin very simply with disagreement is not bigotry. The fact that we hold fast to a scientific definition that for centuries has been understood to be DNA, biologically related, male versus female, immutable in its characteristics. We have got to hold fast. We have got to also stand up against the fear of being called names because for lack of courage, unfortunately, the people will fail. We need to hold fast to what the Supreme Court's always held, what civil rights law has always been governed on, and we need to fight the rules coming from this administration with every tool in our arsenal.
We hold these truths to be self evident seems to be a phrase that can't even be applied anymore in this country. Well, Sarah Parshall Perry, thanks for joining us. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight.